Thank you very much, Asgir, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for what I hope will be a fascinating discussion about a truly fantastic film. I've seen it. I hope everybody on the call has seen it. We sent around a link. It really goes a long way to helping illuminate a very important part of our history. First of all, as the U.S. Foreign Service, as America's diplomats, but also as a key part of the history of our country. And so we'll have a chance later to salute everybody who contributed to making this important film and honoring some of our greatest predecessors in the field of diplomacy who had to deal with a whole lot of challenges as the film explores. I'm not going to talk too much. I just wanted to say thank you for joining us, and I wanted to introduce our moderator today. Our moderator is Maria Hart, who's a member of AFSA's Governing Board from the State Department. She was appointed to fill a vacancy in the board in September 2020 and elected to a 2-year term in June 2021. And Maria has served in a lot of places in her 17 years in the Foreign Service, because I want people to recognize just how much our people do and how much sacrifice and commitment and dedication is involved in this career. I'm going to run through them real quick. Maria is probably going to be annoyed at that, but Maria served in Accra, Tel Aviv, Baghdad, Tashkent, Wellington, Antananarivo, Kabul, and Washington. I think that's a pretty impressive career in 17 years. So with that, I want to hand over to Maria. Thank everybody again for coming, and I will stand by for questions. Thank you.
Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm excited about this event as film is one of my passions, and Foreign Service is like next in line. So I want to introduce our filmmakers, a very illustrious group of young women. Leola Calzolai Stewart is an editor and producer with over 10 years experience working in nonfiction, film, and video. She's worked with a large range of clientele from government agencies to independent filmmakers and on projects from short branded videos to long form documentaries. Welcome, Leola. Next, we have Rochelle Shapiro. Rochelle is an award-winning producer, director, and writer with 15 years in the industry producing high-end films and videos for a wide range of clientele from government agencies to nonprofits to independent films. With budgets ranging from $5,000 to over $500,000, she has produced projects requiring locations and crew around the country, casting and directing union and non-union talent, and directing realistic performances and interviews from non-actors. And last, we have Kylie Krakowskis. Did I say it correctly?
Krakowskis, yep, you got it.
After working as a corporate film producer for several years in DC, she realized her goal was to direct her first documentary review. Released in 2013, The Last Song Before the War was described by NPR Music as one of the best recently released music films, and received a National Endowment for the Arts grant for post-production and outreach. Again, welcome.
Thank you.
So we're going to get right into the discussion because, you know, this is a hot topic right now. And it's also to close out Black History Month. And given that the legacy and history of what you've uncovered here, I'm certain that most of our participants, if not all of our participants, are sitting on the edge of their seat and they can't, you have to say, because I know I can't wait to hear what you all have to say. So first question, Leola, you have a personal connection to this subject matter. Tell us how you and your fellow filmmakers at Flow State Films discovered this particular story and came to make this documentary about these three men in particular. Why did you make this film?
Well, the idea really came as a convergence of things. As you said, I have a personal connection with the Foreign Service. My husband's a diplomat, and we've been a Black Foreign Service family for little over 20 years now. And we would often, go to post and be one of the few, if not only, Black Foreign Service families within the post community. And, after a while, you want to dig into why that's so. At the same time, my husband had the honor of meeting some amazing Black diplomats that had started their careers in the late 50s and 60s. And they would share their experiences of navigating the early parts of their careers. And he always thought that these were really interesting stories that not many people knew about. And that, if we didn't share these stories would the details of those stories pass away with that generation of diplomats. And at the same time, he handed me a book called Black Diplomacy by Michael Krenn, who is featured in the film. And I think it's a book that I think many in the audience are probably familiar with. And those three things converging were really the inspiration for this film. And I brought the idea to my partners, Kylie and Rochelle at Flow State Films, and we decided to take a leap and develop this project into a film and try to tell a compelling story about the early history of Black diplomats, the Black experience in diplomacy.
Awesome. I can share that sentiment going out to post, So I'm going to ask you, we're looking at Ambassador Todman, Ambassador Dudley, and Ambassador Rowan. Have the families of the three men reacted, giving you reactions, talked with you, and worked with you on this film? What was that like, garnering all of that information from them?
Yeah, they've been very supportive of the project. The Dudley family shared their archives with us. Edward Dudley Jr. is in the film. It was very important to him. I think for him, his father was really known as a lawyer and a judge. And I think to share the early part of his father's career in diplomacy was important. So that was, so we've gotten a very positive reaction. The Todman family as well shared their archives with us. We interviewed Mrs. Todman in St. Thomas, had discussions with her son as well. And the Rowan family, Jeffrey Rowan is in the film, and his father has a really wonderful archival collection at Oberlin College, which is his alma mater. And they opened that up to us for use in the film as well.
And I'll add that the briefing room at the State Department is named after Carl Rowan. And when we interviewed Jeffrey at the State Department, we brought him in to the briefing room to show him the plaque and the picture of his dad on the wall, which he had never seen. And that was a really touching moment for us to be able to witness him see that for the first time.
That's awesome. Wow. That's odd that he didn't know that. It's unfortunate too, but thank you for that. Thank you for that. Yeah. So we know that Blackish diplomats, they struggle with tensions of advocating for American life or the American way of life abroad while facing brutal discrimination at home. Why do you think these three ambassadors were willing to represent America despite the inhumanity and the inequality they faced at home?
Well, I think it's a personal decision, something that each diplomat of that time period probably had to answer for themselves and find comfort and purpose with that decision. I think for the protagonist in our film particularly, I think there was a sense of wanting to create space for people of color in an institution like the State Department and the Foreign Service, and maybe even saw that as one of the civil rights battlegrounds in terms of representation and being able to add their voices to, an institution that had a long history of discrimination and elitism. I think it was important to create that space. And so I think, for them, it was, like I said, part of the civil rights movement to a certain degree, you know. I don't know if Rochelle and Kylie have a different perspective or wanted to add to that.
I mean, I would just also add, I think there was a belief in American ideals, even if in practice at home, you know, we weren't living up to those ideals. It's still, you know, a global symbol to hope for and fight for. And so that's something I admire about all three of them, for trying to push this country to a better place idealistically.
Rochelle, you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I mean, I think, you know, Kylie and Leola summarized it pretty well. I think, you know, as Carol Anderson says in the film, you know, it's slowly chipping away on the inside. You know, you need both the protests on the outside and the people on the inside and these institutions doing the work to push them forward towards the ideals, you know, that Kylie was just speaking about. And I think that's what these three men saw themselves as part of.
It was a perfect opportunity, actually. And given the situation, Black diplomats were limited to serve in only 4 to 5 predominantly, if not all, Black countries at the most. So how much damage did this cause to American interest abroad, you think? And could the presence of, or the increased presence of, Black diplomats help further U.S. interests at that particular point in time in our history?
Okay, well, I'll go first. I mean, I think, you know, the time that Edward R. Dudley, Terence Todman, and Carl Rowan, when you're looking at the 40s through the early 60s, is a moment when the United States was really trying to garner support from countries that were becoming independent, right? And the world is mostly non-white. And so when you are saying to these countries that the United States is the embodiment of democracy, embodiment of equality and freedom, it is a little, it calls into question the real commitment to those ideals if it's not really reflected not only in American society itself, but even in the diplomatic corps that you're sending abroad to represent that country. And so when you have, when you're confining Black diplomats and diplomats of color to only a handful of posts, you're really undercutting in many ways the message that you're trying to send abroad, right? I mean, American foreign policy at that point would have been much better served to have as many people of color as possible in as many countries as possible around the world. And so I think in the end, it really did hurt American interest and really undercut the legitimacy of America in that time period in terms of its commitment to these ideals.
I wholeheartedly agree. Kylie, Rochelle?
I would just say I agree with what Leola said.
Yeah, and I think it gives, you know, especially at this time period, it gave our enemies, you know, more fodder, and it gave truth to the propaganda that they were pushing out. Which, you know, as Carol Anderson also says in the film, it's not propaganda if it's true. I mean, and I think that's really why our, you know, the presidents at the time started to really look at these issues and change things, because they saw how we were being looked at overseas. And, you know, it's unfortunate that it wasn't necessarily just the moral rightness of it that pushed us forward. It was how we looked to other countries and how we were appearing and how it was impacting sort of foreign policy.
Yes. So with all of that, as you guys put together this film, as you did the research, talk to the families, you know, the late nights, the early mornings, the sleepless nights, because these things happen as you're working on a project such as this, because it's not just producing a film, but this is actually a piece that can impact history and actually change hearts and minds. So that's what we look to do, right? Is change hearts and minds. So in all of that, what do you think diplomats do? And should it be clear how diplomats are representing the country, as well as who do you think should represent the country? Like who decides to get, you know, who should represent the country? Did any of that cross your mind, or what would be your take on that?
Who wants to go first?
I'll just say one thing. I don't think I can answer the full question, but one thing that was interesting. Well, I think we all agree that our representatives should reflect the diversity of this country, and that the Foreign Service should not be, elitist. It should feel representative, and it should feel accessible to people of all backgrounds. We did talk a lot about even the exam and the ways in, and what would be the most fair way to bring in, a wide range of people who want to serve and have the talent to serve. So I think we did also interrogate what even are the systems still in place that, make it hard for young people to achieve those career goals. So it's certainly something that we hope with this film that will inspire more people to a Foreign Service career, but also hopefully institutionally decision makers, when we're looking at promotion cycles or how people get hired, think about those nuanced ways of where opportunities are created and made.
And I would just say, prior to us working on this film, even though I see myself as very well read, and I pay attention to the news, I did not know a lot about the work of a diplomat other than through Leola, because this is, she's been my friend for a long time, and I know their families moved around, and we've talked about it on a sort of in a very general way, but really digging into the research of this film. And then it does make you wonder why it is such an enigma, why it does seem to only attract or be clear to a certain group of people who might be interested in it. Why isn't it a more well-known sort of career path? And as Kylie said, the hope is that this film sort of starts that discussion. We would love for it to be shown in high schools and in colleges as a way to shed some light on the history of this career, but also understanding what the opportunities are and the benefits would be to have more inclusivity and a wider pool of talent to pull from.
I'll say this too. It's by law, the diplomatic corps needs to reflect the American population, right? It's is it the Foreign Service Act of 1980? It should, the diplomatic corps needs to be a reflection of the American people. And so if diplomacy is a representation of American people, then the diplomats need to reflect that. And it has to be intentional, and it can't be happenstance. It has to be one that we work towards with intention, with effort, with commitment. And so, I am a little, hopeful actually that with the new Office on Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Ambassador Abercrombie Winstanley and her team and the efforts that they're really doing to kind of really interrogate this issue and see what can be done institutionally to change the culture, to change the pipeline, and to retain, diplomats of color within the Foreign Service.
Exactly. And I want to say now, with that, and then let's consider what all has transpired over the last year, maybe to 2 years. So and not just then, when we had Todman, Dudley, and Rowan being the trailblazers for people of color in Foreign Service and the Foreign Service, but even now, but starting from that point till now, as developing countries follow and look at and see issues that come up, but back then the racial unrest that was going on in America. Many may have come to distrust American intervention. How do you think diplomats can, and if possible, counteract this? In other words, beat down the propaganda that's being fostered in other places that want to undermine our very own mission. And so that's one, how can diplomats counter what people are seeing in the States that's happening? the ones out in the field? And do you think that the more recent occurrences of civil unrest have impacted the workplace and the work that diplomats do abroad?
Yeah, I mean, I will say, to answer the second part first, I mean, I think there were highly publicized articles in the papers, the Post, New York Times, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, you know, when the murder of George Floyd and the protests and uprising that happened, the foreign policy impact on that was well covered. Ferguson as well, well covered. So I think, yes, what happens domestically in terms of racial justice and equality does impact our foreign policy or how we are perceived overseas. Definitely. Now, how that impacts an individual diplomat in the workplace and vis-a-vis their relations with another country, I can't really, I would be curious for diplomats to answer that question. And if, you know, what did they experience during these time periods, and what are the questions they ask themselves, you know, in terms of representing America overseas during these moments. You know, I know that early on in the development of the film, we shared a trailer with some people within the department, and you know, someone came back to me and said, you know, it's bringing up interesting questions, and she knew that she had some diplomats that she was mentoring who said that they were having a difficult time explaining the United States in moments like this, and weren't sure how to answer questions sometimes. But I know that with, you know, one thing that I took away, particularly with Ambassador Todman, and learning more about him and learning more about his diplomacy and his career, is that he never shied away from an honest conversation. And I think what a diplomat of color does bring to the table is an authentic representation of their experience in the United States, and being able to explain what they've experienced in a way that is genuine. And so I think it is meaningful, you know, in terms of having those honest conversations. And I think Ambassador Todman was a reflection of that.
Yes. Rachel, Kyle?
No, I think I don't have anything to add to that, Kylie.
I see Jim Dandridge in the attendees, and he has just a line in the film where he's talking about Terence Todman speaking about the US and, you know, civil rights issues. And he says, you know, if it was ugly, he would say it's ugly, and he wasn't afraid of the truth. And I think there's power in not hiding the truth, you know, and that is part of the democratic process of, you know, reckoning with our truth. So that's probably one of my favorite lines in the film. So I'd be curious what other diplomats have experienced in the field in encountering those hard conversations, but that was a takeaway for me personally.
Well, you guys will have some Q&A, so get ready. One of the things I want to note is that as the Cold War intensified, Ambassador Dudley argued that developing countries were looking to America to live up to its ideals. How would embracing non-white diplomats at this time, so diplomats of color, how could that contribute to this statement that Ambassador Dudley noted? I can repeat it again. Would you like me to?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. My audio cut out actually too. So I couldn't hear the question.
Okay. So as the Cold War intensified, Ambassador Dudley argued that the developing countries were looking to the US, to America, to live up to its ideals. But think about the messages we were sending back, like sending out. So how would the increase of non-white diplomats in the field help counter those images that were being published and broadcast overseas at this point in time, to help actually maybe diminish or even wipe out the Cold War?
Well, I mean, I think, as we said before, I think when the US is, especially during that time period, really trying to project an image of equality, democracy, and freedom, to have diplomats of color in positions to represent the United States would provide a more honest story, I think, of what it is to be American, be Black American, be an American of color during that time period. And I think as Ambassador Todman, his experience, having those honest conversations only strengthens, I think, those personal diplomatic connections can only strengthen how you relate to another country. And by not having diplomats of color, you're just perpetuating what the world already thinks, which is pale, male, and yell, and when you're interacting with a world that is majority non-white, that sends a message that I think is very counter productive or intuitive, or to what America was trying to project at that time period.
And what do we project? I'm going to ask you guys a question. What do you think we're projecting when we continually send, non-minority representation overseas and to places where maybe a person of color, a person of a minority heritage group would benefit? Like, what are we saying? What are we saying to the world?
I mean, I think you're probably saying we still have a lot of work to do in many ways, right? And that's reflected in our diplomatic corps. And yeah, I mean, I don't want to talk too much. I don't know if Rochelle and Kylie.
Well, I mean, we do also have a lot of work to do at home. I mean, I think representation is a huge step forward, but we also have to have real racial justice at home, and we have to do the hard work here too. And so it just makes me think, again, with what we're still seeing with ongoing racial violence in this country, it's a hard walk to walk. I think for a lot of us, even if we're not in the foreign service or civil servants, it's still tough to reconcile this country at times. And so I mean, of course, I think representation matters, but we've got to be able to let people represent a country that they're proud to represent too.
Well, I think it's also electing leaders that understand the importance of diversifying the workforce and what that representation means. And, it seems that Secretary Blinken does believe in that, in what he's done with the appointment of Ambassador Abercrombie Winstanley.
Yes.
But I think it's not just, it takes the Todmans and the Rowans and the Dudleys coming up from the bottom, but it also takes leadership from the top in creating these spaces and breaking down these sort of embedded foundational sort of policies that have kept people out or made it harder to get in. And that takes a lot of work and a lot of time.
It does take time. So overall, what's been the reaction to the film from the State Department and the diplomatic community? And what do you want people to take away from this film?
I mean, I think overall the response has been pretty positive. The State Department we've been doing quite a few screenings at different embassies overseas. So I think overall the reaction has been fantastic. And for me personally, in making this film, Rochelle and Kylie also, we wanted to create a film that would spark this type of conversation. And we wanted to open the world of diplomacy up so that viewers who weren't familiar with what diplomats do could get a taste of what that diplomatic experience is. But also, I really wanted young viewers of color to see this film and connect with it in these characters in some way, and these protagonists in some way, to see that we as people of color can add our voices to how this country is represented overseas. And then these are a handful of individuals who helped create that space, and hopefully inspire, younger viewers of color to join in.
Yes. Kylie, Rochelle.
I would just echo what Leola said. I mean, I think we all sort of have the same goals for this film. And it has, I mean, we're grateful, so grateful for this and so many events. I mean, I think we've been overwhelmed by the reception by the Foreign Service community and the State Department. We didn't have these lined up before we made the film or anything. It's all emerged from the film being completed. And so it's an honor really that it resonates with the community.
I think like if we were not in a COVID situation, having this featured in the department with a nice swank little reception afterward, where there would be lots of conversation and lots of talking, that would have been the perfect opportunity to really just have a lot of like upfront personal, real raw feedback. But we hope to have that today. So before I close out, Leola, this is your directorial debut. Can you tell us a bit about your experience as a first-time director, and especially a project such as this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was lucky because I had two partners that are very experienced directors. So they took this leap of faith with me on this project and really uplifted me and to make me feel very supported in making this film. So as a first-time director, I cannot ask for a better team and a better partnership than Kylie and Rochelle. And yeah, I mean, I think like any first-time director, you have a lot of doubt and, you just have to kind of push forward and believe in the importance of the story. I mean, this, as I said before, this was personally meaningful to me. And so it was definitely a passion project. It took us 7 years to make, 6 years of fundraising and 1 year of production. So it was definitely something that we were committed to doing. And so I'm really proud of us and our ability to get the film out there and made.
I'll say it didn't take a leap to support Leola in her directorial debut.
The Leola fan club here.
Yes.
Well, I'm a fan of all of you ladies. I think this is a phenomenal project. It tells a tremendously phenomenal story of three trailblazers that I think in the face of what could have been the worst time in our history went out unafraid. And that's just for all of us as diplomats, unafraid. We have to be unafraid. I know sometimes even just little simple situations, you have to be unafraid, especially overseas, because it's just a different way of life. And so thank you for making this film.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
So now we're going to let's move into some Q&A. Askir, is this something that I should do or will you do this?
I will take it over from here. We're
Perfect.
going to encourage everyone who would like to ask a question to type it into the Q&A box, and we will do our best to answer as many as possible. We also have a few questions that were emailed in advance by folks who weren't able to join us today. So we'll try to get to those as well. So let's start with the first one, which is what kind of support did the filmmakers and producers receive in terms of financing and specifically from the Department of State, if any?
Want me to do that one? So we did not have any financing from the Department of State. We had basically, it took us about 6 years to raise the funds for this film. It started with a small grant from the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities, and then we received a scripting grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and that allowed us to hire a writer and write a full script of the film and interview some of the scholars you see in the final film. And from there, we were awarded pretty substantial grant again from the National Endowment for Humanities for production. And then over the next couple of years, we still had to match that money, and we got some support from Black Public Media, Firelight Media, and then it culminated in a phone call November of last year still in the midst of COVID with WGBH in Boston, American Experience. They were interested in the film, they had heard about it, and they came in with the final funding. So it was a final co-production with American Experience. So it was a very kind of methodical momentum build of funding over the years.
I'll say too that even just the support that public media partners like Black Public Media and Firelight Media gave was incredible. Those are both organizations really dedicated to amplifying the voices of BIPOC filmmakers. And so they saw the potential in this project and really helped us sort of make more connections within the film community to push the project forward. So that was really instrumental too in keeping the momentum, I think, because after 6 years, it's sometimes hard to keep the momentum. And these were organizations that really helped push us forward. And NEH was like unwavering in their support, which was also fantastic.
Thank you all for that. Next question. In your excellent film, in addition to the scarcity of Black diplomats in the Foreign Service, I was struck by the scarcity of female diplomats. Did you consider including the story of a Black female diplomat in your film? If so, whom?
Yeah, so this is a great question. You know, when we were developing the film, we were really focused on keeping it within a certain time period because we felt that it really reflected some current themes that people could connect with. And, you know, we had spoken to some powerhouse female Black ambassadors like Ruth Davis and Harriet Elam Thomas and Aurelia Brazil, who's in the film, gave a fantastic interview. And so during that time period, a lot of those careers started kind of towards the tail end of where we were ending our film. We have been speaking internally about possibly, you know, picking up the baton and doing something on gender and equity in the Foreign Service as well. Something that really stands out to me is Harriet Elam Thomas in her book, Diversifying Diplomacy. She says that gender was a higher obstacle for her to overcome in many ways than race in the Foreign Service. And I think that's a very telling statement. So yes, there are numerous stories of women diplomats that were not able to address in this film that are worthy of their own films and their own explorations as well.
Thank you very much. Next question is, how were the commentators in the film, other than family members of the three ambassadors, identified and selected?
How were the commentators? Okay, so meaning the historians, essentially. Well, I would highly recommend everybody pick up the work of each of these historians because they really do some fascinating work in the field. These are all historians who had done work on this particular time period and exploring Black engagement with foreign policy during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. You know, there was a question that we were asked earlier about, like, for example, how America was representing itself overseas and its impact on foreign policy. Mary Dudziak, who's featured in the film, has a fantastic book called Cold War Civil Rights. If you're interested in seeing how embassies around the world were responding to the racial violence that was happening in the United States, she details that from Truman through Kennedy. Brenda Gale Plummer has written like the definitive text, I think, on Black engagement with foreign affairs and international relations called Rising Wind. And she also goes from like the 1930s through the 60s. Nicholas Cole is a USIA expert and public diplomacy expert. So he had a lot to add about USIA and Carl Rowan's time there. And Carol Anderson we're like the fangirl club of Carol Anderson. I mean, she's done a lot, especially on the NAACP and its engagement with foreign policy. Adrian Lynn Smith. These were all people that were like writing on Cold War history, writing on Black engagement with foreign policy. So they were critical, I think, for us to kind of build the context, the historical context in which these ambassadors were working. And Michael Krenn, I mean, I think he's written the only book that I know of that is dealing specifically with Black diplomats in the State Department during this time period.
Thank you. We have a lot more questions coming in. Next one starts by congratulating you on a beautiful film, and then asks whether the State Department has asked you to collaborate with the Diplomacy Museum on mounting exhibits featuring these three diplomats.
Well, I know that the Diplomacy Museum wanted to actually do a screening with the film, but because of COVID, those plans have been delayed. But they were supportive of the project during our development, and I think are very interested in trying to figure out a way to host a screening to discuss these issues. And I know that they're actively looking to build their collection as well in terms of highlighting ephemera, archival of Black diplomats and their contribution to American diplomacy.
Thank you. Next question. You mentioned the diplomats of the film voiced never shying away from having a difficult conversation, which Ms. Hart also noted was a demonstration of being unafraid. I wonder if you could speak further on this, including any insights regarding the strengths these ambassadors drew on for that courage.
Can you repeat that question again? I'm sorry.
The question is essentially if you could speak on any insights that you have about the strengths these three ambassadors drew on for the courage to never shy away from having a difficult conversation.
Okay, I think for Ambassador Dudley, you know, one thing that we always kept in mind was that he was an NAACP lawyer. So I think he was well skilled in using institutional policy to help change it, right? Being able to break it down in a legal way and in a way that was very factual, and presenting it in a way that I think really highlighted his legal training, which is something that we all found very interesting. I think Terence Todman, you know, one thing that kept coming up in a lot of the interviews was that his, you know, growing up in the Virgin Islands, I think really informed his sense of self and his strength in terms of, you know, not really willing to sort of back down from what he saw as something that was unjust, and unafraid to speak to that and try to change it. You know, I think another great line in the film is Jim Dandridge, "I don't have a problem, you have a problem." That was Terence Todman's, you know, viewpoint on that. And, you know, Carl Rowan was the great communicator. He was the journalist. And I think, you know, that's what got him, you know, highlighted by Kennedy into the State Department, and eventually the head of USIA, which was the organization at that time really charged with communicating the American message overseas. I don't know if Kylie and Rochelle want to add anything to that.
I think that was perfect.
All right, thank you. Moving on to the next question. I thought the film really resonated with issues today, how to represent a country which at times feels imperfect to your experience. Was that intentional? It was very powerful.
Yeah, I think it was intentional. Kylie, go ahead. I see you were going to say
No, I
something.
mean, yeah, no, I like it's a great question. I think it was definitely that is the power of staying truly historical. I mean, it does allow us to look at the present moment, but without this being a, present day film. But yeah, I think these are issues all of us here grapple with. And we did hope the film would illuminate that.
Yeah, and we've been working on this, as Leal has said, for 7 years. So there's been a lot in the social climate in this country that has happened and shifted and has brought more questions and more sort of, I think, relevance to this history in a way that we wish wasn't the case. But I think it is very apparent, as you noted, that how much things resonate today in this film.
Both. Here's a bit of a wider question. As members of the Foreign Service, we know that many people don't understand what we do. I'd be interested if the filmmakers have ideas for how to tell our stories more broadly.
That's interesting. You go,
ahead,
sorry,
Leal.
Michelle.
I've been reflecting for myself because when I was in high school, I was a student ambassador, and I did go to the Soviet Union and the Baltic states, on a 3-week experience. And I went to the State Department and had State Department briefings, and I really loved it. I still didn't leave that program really knowing how to go work for the Foreign Service. So I do think more engagement with young people is one step, is, getting in high schools and colleges and I don't know, career fairs. I don't know if that sounds basic in a way, but just really painting a picture of what a diplomat actually does and and I know there are different skills, there's different cones. So you can be good at science and do some things, or good at languages and do other things, or serve at, USAID. There's all kinds of different ways to serve in the Foreign Service. And I think the more outreach to young people and to teachers and career centers at diverse colleges, community colleges, where you can create a pipeline, I think that would be one way to start.
And I think it's also about introducing the topics at a younger and younger age. What is diplomacy? That simple question that should be taught really in elementary school in a really basic way, so that by the time students get to high school, they really have an understanding. It's really putting an importance on like civics and democracy and how it works and how it's difficult and how you have to work at it and how it's about relationship building. And I think that there has been sort of a less and less emphasis on civics and the sort of curriculums in our schools that I think there needs to be a re-emphasis. If anything, the last, I think, 5 or 6 years has taught us is how important those lessons are, and we need more of them in our school systems.
I think also, there's the whole diplomat and residence program at the State Department. And, I know that program tends to have a lot to do at the university level, but I do, like to Rochelle's point, like middle school, elementary school, exposing younger kids to what it is to be a diplomat, and also showing that you are using diplomatic skills in your everyday life and probably don't even realize it, that it's not a mysterious profession in some ways, but some like the skills that you garner day to day in terms of, negotiation and conflict resolution. These are all skills that diplomats access and use, and kids are doing that too. They just don't know that they're using their diplomatic skills in what they're doing sometimes. And I think opening up that world at a young age can open up more possibilities.
thanks to you all. Here's a
And why
question.
don't we have, also
Sorry.
there's a lot of commercials about military. Why aren't there commercials about foreign service recruitment? I want to throw that out to the foreign service community. Like, why aren't there PSAs about joining the foreign service,
Well, I think there still is a mystique and maybe a fear with an exam. So again, I question an exam system if it ends up, preventing people from even trying. So, yeah.
All right, thank you. Question from one of our audience members. Why did you not include Ralph Bunche in the film, another distinguished Black diplomats from the 40s through the 60s?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things that we wanted to highlight were some lesser known names, I think. And Ralph Bunche is someone that I hope many people are already familiar with in terms of, the incredible diplomatic work that he did in his lifetime. There's also already a fantastic film that dives into Ralph Bunche's life. William Greaves was the director. Jim Dandridge, who was just in this event, was also, I think, a consultant on that film. So with this project, we really wanted to highlight some lesser known voices, which is why we didn't, dive too deeply or reflect or go into Ralph Bunche's life. I will say that Dr. Kryn has spoken extensively about his inspiration for his book. And one of the inspirations was a memo that was, it was called the Outstanding Negro memo, of where countries to which outstanding Negroes could be sent. And it was a memo that listed the countries that the State Department believed that a Black diplomat could serve. But the only person that they found qualified to be able to do that as an ambassador was Ralph Bunche. So there was a time period when Ralph Bunche was really the only person. Like, if you weren't Ralph Bunche, the State Department wasn't really sure if you could do the job, apparently. So that's just an interesting aside. But yeah, we wanted to focus on lesser known diplomats.
Thank you very much. There's a couple of questions, actually 3 questions that all have the same point, which is, are you working on a sequel?
Well, I mentioned before that we've been talking about, possibly a part 2 to this that would look at women in diplomacy. So that's an idea that we still haven't dived too deeply into, but something that we've discussed and are, hopefully might be able to produce in the next couple of years.
Well, and it sounds like that is a topic that would be well received. So
Yeah.
we, duly noted.
Yes, I think you've had a good focus group here today on that. One question is whether you've had, or the producers have had, requests from school systems around the country to show the film.
Right now, the requests are being directed to WGBH in Boston. So it is our understanding they are getting requests, but I don't think we have the data on that yet. But they will be handling all the educational outreach for the film.
There is a National History Day that's coming up, and the focus this year is on diplomacy. And so there will be, I think, events and projects that high school students across the country will be doing around diplomatic history. And I know that, there's going to be a screening and event with this film as well at some point in the month.
All right, thanks very much. I think we have time for one more question before I pass it back over to Maria and Ambassador Rubin. Sorry, I have a bunch of questions here. How about this one? I've read that concerned about how the world viewed segregation in the US led to legislation outlawing American apartheid. Did your research hit on this theme at all?
How the legislation outlawed American apartheid? I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure. The question is whether how the world viewed segregation in America had any impact on civil rights legislation.
I mean, I think Little Rock is probably the biggest example of how the outside world impacted civil rights, which is Eisenhower didn't really act to move until there was a lot of negative press and response around what was happening in Little Rock. And, you know, I think race relations in the United States was the Achilles heel in many ways for the American experience, for American foreign policy at that time period. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there was definitely an impact on, and the civil rights movement knew it as well. I mean, I think the civil rights movement was very aware of the fact that the world's attention was focused on the movement and what they were doing. Julian Bond in his book said that it was Little Rock was the first time that you know, American racial violence was televised, and they were very aware that the world was watching. So I think there was a definite impact on the movement and on the American government's, you know, wanting to act on it.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's question, but I want to pass it over to Maria and Ambassador Rubin, and for everyone to have any final comments.
Maria?
I don't have any final comments other than the fact that this has been a great, I think this has definitely been a great session on filmmaking, but also the power and the impact of filmmaking and telling our story. And I, you know, looking at it, I will tell you, I watched it 3 times because I really just, I had to come back yet again. And there were some really good quotes in there, I think, that you ladies garnered, and I should have written more of them down. But for time's sake, you know, we could be here probably 2 hours talking about it. But thank you for telling the story. Thank you for taking the time to do the research and doing the legwork, because that's part of why our stories aren't being told, the time and the effort and the energy. So thank you for the labor of love. Over to Ambassador Rubin.
Thank you. And let me just echo everything Maria just said, and thank both Maria and Asgir, and of course our panelists, for this really great discussion about a really great film. I did want to pick up just briefly in closing on something Leola just said, and that was talking about the way the subjects of this film had to encounter the reality of America during the Eisenhower administration, and certainly even earlier in their careers, for some of them in the Truman administration going forward. And in many cases, the biggest obstacle was not outright racism. It was unspoken passivity and acceptance of things that weren't right. So, you know, based not only on this film, but people I've talked to, you know, probably almost never did anyone say to them, we don't want Black people in the Foreign Service. You're not welcome here. Get out, go home. It was all couched in very polite, evasive terminology that absolves the people who were doing the talking of responsibility, including our most senior officials, including the Secretary of State. So I just offer that, since we're still dealing with this as a country and as a foreign service, as a thought. Obviously, you've got to confront outright racism, but we also have to confront passivity and acceptance of things that aren't right from people who may not think of themselves as racist and may well not be, but everybody has to play a role in addressing these issues. And it's a lot of baggage that we've inherited from several hundred years of our history. So enough from me, but I wanted to just say thank you again to the filmmakers, to our panelists, to everybody who's joined us. It's a fantastic discussion, and I hope we can do more to explore this really important chapter of our history and honor these amazing American diplomats. So thank you.
Thank you
So
for having
much.
us. Yeah.
Wonderful
Yes,
conversation.
thank you.
Thank you.
To everyone.
Thank you.